In July 1739, colonial Americans start reading in their newspapers about an Anglican minister named George Whitefield. And he's in the news because he's preaching to people in England and Scotland in these large outdoor revival meetings in which between 10 and 20,000 people go to hear him speak. And there's no city in America that has 20,000 people, so this is an astonishing number for them. These people are flocking to hear him speak, and they're experiencing a religious conversion or awakening because of these sermons. So George Whitefield becomes a sensation overnight. He basically becomes the first celebrity in America because of the way newspapers circulate this news. Everyone knows who he is, and every newspaper starts to print his sermons in their papers. There are 5 books on him by the end of the year, including his own journal, which he submits to printers. So George Whitefield really knows how to work his audience. He really knows how to get a lot of people interested and really spread his message. And in October 1739, George Whitefield comes to America. He goes to Delaware, then he goes to Pennsylvania, then down through the South. And he has a very theatrical style. He's trained as an actor. And on November 8th, 1739, his first sermon in America attracts 6,000 people. He preaches for 3 days, and each sermon had between 5 and 10,000 people. Now, there's a lot of reactions to George Whitefield. Here's a couple reactions to George Whitefield. One from Benjamin Franklin, who ended up becoming a very good friend with George Whitefield, which makes sense. Benjamin Franklin is a printer, and you want to be, if you are a printer, right, if you're a journalist, the one thing you want to become friends with is the celebrity, right? You want to have that inside scoop, right? So he becomes friends with George Whitefield, and George Whitefield uses Ben Franklin to promote his own celebrity. So they have a really great working relationship, which should inform you how you read this quote. So this is from Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. He wrote, he's talking about how, he didn't know George Whitefield, but he went to go to his first sermon to hear what, this guy is about. And Benjamin Franklin sort of says, I don't believe in religion, and, I'm not really a religious person, but I'll go hear this guy. And so Benjamin Franklin says, I had in my pocket a handful of copper money, 3 or 4 silver dollars, and 5 pistoles in gold. And pistoles are Spanish money. As he proceeded, that is George Whitefield, I began to soften, and concluded to give the coppers. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed of that, and determined me to give the silver. And he finished so admirably that I emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all. What Benjamin Franklin is saying, and he's not being completely honest, is that, this man is so wonderful that even I, the skeptic, gave all my money to this man. And he does that because by making George Whitefield seem really very amazing and able to convert even a skeptic, you should go read his sermons, and you should go to his talks, and you should read his journals. And by the way, I'm the printer. I can print all of these things for you. So it's a little disingenuous. But here's another quote for someone who doesn't have that ulterior motive. This is Nathan Cole. He's a farmer in Connecticut. And when he had heard that George Whitefield was coming to town, he dropped everything and ran to the sermon as fast as he could so he could get there. And so he writes, when he finally sees George Whitefield on stage. This is a lot less polished. This is just a guy, and so it's a little awkward writing, but you can sense the sort of true emotion that Nathan Cole really feels. So he writes, when I saw Mr. Whitefield come upon the scaffold, he looked almost angelical, a young, slim, slender youth before some thousands of people with a bold, undaunted countenance. And my hearing how God was with him everywhere as he came along, it solemnized in my mind and put me into a trembling fear before he began to preach. For he looked as if he was clothed with authority from the great God, and a sweet, solemn solemnity sat upon his brow, and my hearing him preach gave me a heart wound. By God's blessing, my old foundation was broken up. And so Nathan Cole is actually having a religious experience. He's actually having a sort of revelatory experience in which he realizes through what George Whitefield is saying that his whole religious perspective is all wrong, and he's changing his mind, and he's really sort of afraid of what he did before, but also realizing that sort of God is there to help him. So it's a really strong religious experience for Nathan Cole. And here we have some images of George Whitefield. Now, Benjamin Franklin and Nathan Cole really liked George Whitefield, and were very proud of it. But George Whitefield was a very controversial figure. So if you look at these three images, these are images from people who did not like George Whitefield, who thought that his preaching was disingenuous, that he was a quack, that or that he was dangerous by getting people so excited. So one of the things about George Whitefield was that he preached an evangelical message. To be really religious, you have to feel it. You have to feel it in your heart. You can't think it. Right? You can't just read the Bible and study the Bible and learn Greek or Latin, and that's how to be saved. No, he's like, no, you have to feel it. You have to have that religious conversion experience, and that as part of that, everyone is equal. Right? Only people who've had that revelatory experience are the saved ones, and if you haven't had that, well, you're nothing. Well, this really turns this sort of social hierarchy on its head, right? Because if anybody can have this revelatory experience, you could be a woman, you could be a slave, you could be a child, right? If you are a Puritan minister, if you are already part of the elite, right, this could be very threatening. So if you look at these images, right, you see some of the portrayal of that anxiety and some of that sort of disgust of George Whitefield portrayed in these images. If you look at, for one, George Whitefield is portrayed as cross-eyed. And he probably was a little cross-eyed, but they definitely emphasize that in these images. And being cross-eyed is connected with being a little bit crazy in the 17th century. And so you're saying, okay, look, he's cross-eyed, he's a little bit crazy. He's he's not all there, so be wary. But more than that, if you look at the image on the left, Stephen Moore in this other portrait, where you can see on the right, here's a guy sort of toasting George Whitefield with a canister of beer, and he looks relatively unkempt. And you have what is definitely sort of poor people face. They're not particularly good looking. And this was a common thing. How do you show whether or not someone is a good or bad? Well, if they're pretty, that's a good person. If they're ugly, that's a bad person. And so if you look at this, they tended to portray less good-looking people as the audience of George Whitefield. The dregs of society are the ones who like George Whitefield. And they're really sort of rivals. So when I talk about revivals, I'm talking about two things here. The First Great Awakening is a major religious revival that existed across many colonies at the same time, and it goes between 1739, when George Whitefield first arrived, to about 1760, when the revival sort of peters out, and it's from Massachusetts down to Georgia. And the First Great Awakening is a revival, and what that means is that a revival is when people become more interested in religion, and more people go to church, and they become a little bit more interested in religion, they become a little more fanatical. We see more people buying religious tracts, we see more people going to church, we see more people worried about religious things, and George Whitefield's presence inspires a level of revivals among a lot of different congregations. Now, revivals aren't necessarily new. A lot of churches experienced periodic revivals throughout history. And revivals are really this outpouring of religious feeling, a sort of an attention towards spirituality, an interest in religion, a general care about your personal salvation. And it generally follows a period of psycho-thinking or declension, or perceived declension, a time when people were not thinking about this. And it also follows economic hard times, right? So it's a sort of, the revivals are a response to when things are really hard. Now, several churches in the colonies and actually elsewhere in the world experience revivals on a periodic basis. If you have a local passionate preacher, if something happens in the community, you often get sort of local revivals. The First Great Awakening is separate because it became a revival that crosses colonies and crosses time. It becomes a larger phenomenon where you see a lot more enthusiasm, that's the other term, behind this. And you see in both of these, I talked about New Lights. New Lights are people who were in favor of these revivals, were in favor of the Great Awakening, wanted more sort of personal, revelatory, religious experience. And Old Lights were people who thought this was a bad thing, that churches should be about order and structure and study and not about sort of more evangelical practices. Now, the most famous early revivalist before George Whitefield was Jonathan Edwards, and he was a minister in Northampton, and he's responsible for a series of revivals in the late 1730s that brings in a lot of converts, and he writes about how there was these 4 teenagers who got upset because one of their friends committed suicide, and Edward confronts them, and he leads them to a sense that they need to worry about their salvation now. They tell their friends, and it sort of snowballs and becomes this revival in Northampton, Massachusetts. And Jonathan Edwards writes about it in Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which is possibly the most famous piece of American colonial literature. And it's this great sermon of fire and brimstone, the idea that everyone is a sinner, and God can punish us at any moment. And even if you just mind your own business and take care of yourself and your family, if you don't accept God and Christ into your heart, you are a sinner. And the only way to avoid hell at any moment is to repent. And so the people who support that, the sort of New Lights, they really believe that this is important, and it leads to a certain level of enthusiasm. And George Whitefield reads that, and it's sort of what inspires him to come to America and link the revivals that were happening in England to the revivals in America. But this enthusiasm can really get out of hand. So there's a minister, Davenport, who starts getting really enthusiastic about this revelatory experience, and he begins to see the sort of sinfulness of all material goods, and he decides to burn all luxury imported clothes that he owns. And so he creates this big bonfire, and he makes this big ceremony of like, this is sinful and this is sinful, and the people around him are watching him, and he starts to take off his own pants, and a woman says, you know what, maybe you've gone a little too far, and she makes him put his pants back on and walk away. But the Old Lights tend to look at these revivals as this has gone too far. People go too far. When they're enthusiastic, you have revivals, meetings where people are swooning, they're shaking, and they're barking like dogs. They're rolling around on the ground. They're crying out. They're speaking in tongues. And this is seen as, what is this world coming to, that this is how people are acting. And so you see the split between those who like the revivals, the New Lights, who tend to be a little bit younger, tend to have had problems, maybe some economic problems, and this is a wonderful release, but also an answer to their problems. And the Old Lights, who tend to be older, more educated, wealthier, and really dislike this challenge to their authority. And a lot